So, hello and welcome everyone to this our Tuesday Spotlight in September 2025. I am particularly excited about this one. So, as editor of the Egyptian Archaeology magazine by the Egypt Exploration Society, I have the joy of reading all of the articles firsthand before everyone else. And this is following one that was published in our latest magazine, which I will hold up, Egyptian Archaeology 66, which came out in spring 2025. And Lisa Randisi, our speaker today, published Between Object and Archive, which is the title of our event today. And of course, EES members should have already received a copy of this magazine, or you can read it online. And at the moment, you can even get a nice deal on the last three issues of our magazine in our EA Trio pack, which includes this magazine. So if you do want to find out more, please do become a member to get the magazine or do buy a copy from our online shop. But let's hear more about the topic today. So between object and archive, we're looking at archaeological ephemera and how that can tell us more about archaeologists at the turn of the 20th century. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker for today, Lisa Randisi.
Hello, hello.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And just to give a bit of background about Lisa, she is the Curatorial and Collections Assistant at the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology. She has worked as a field archaeologist in the Middle East and Inner Asia since 2010. At the Petrie Museum, she runs the Archaeological Ephemera project and is building an international community of practice around archaeological ephemera in historic collections. Her research activities touch on the history and legacies of early archaeology, the impacts of heritage engagement in the present, and developing inclusive and representative museum practices for the future. So thank you so much for joining our event programme to talk more about this topic, Lisa. I will hand the Zoom room over to you.
All right, thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thanks everyone from coming from all over the world. So I am here to talk to you about ephemera. Now, you might ask, what the hell is ephemera? So when I talk about ephemera, what I mean is containers, historic packaging, tins and boxes, paper items, or archival material associated with objects from the collection. So notes, clippings, old museum labels, correspondence, wrapping paper, newspaper, recycled envelopes, Victorian cotton wool, and also old museum labels and other material that's attesting to museum activities, like old mounts and things like that. Now, all this material was once discarded by museum curators as, direct quote, surplus to requirements, direct quote from our archive. In fact, in the 1980s, an object donor wrote to the curator to say, if you're going to check out the cigarette boxes, which I think you shouldn't, as it has all the information on it, please let me know, as I'd like it back. So I think the mindset around this material has changed since then. Everyone I've spoken to since I've started this project has gone and said, oh, we have a box of this material in our museum office. It's really exciting, but we don't really know what to do with it. So at the Petrie Museum, I've been documenting and contextualizing this material for the last 3 years. It's dotted all around the museum. At the moment, I'm on 800 pieces and counting. And I'm here to hopefully convince you of its huge potential in research, in storytelling, interpretation, display, etc. So to me, the value and the beauty of this material is that it's got 2, sometimes 3 layers of storytelling combined. The reuse, repurpose, recycle element of this means that it's accidentally preserved more or less ephemeral stories that you wouldn't find anywhere else. What do I mean by that? Well, the first layer is the original story of this item of ephemera as a social history object. For example, here with cigarette packets, what that tells us about the original industry and its relationship to the story of early archaeology, to life in the field and in academia. The next layer up is the reuse of these objects in the field as archaeological tools for packing, for display, as labels. That tells us something new about early archaeological practice that might not have been written down. And then the third layer that we sometimes get is these objects are once again reused in collections and in the museum as labels, as new containers for display, for sampling. We can do some real museum drawer stratigraphy, which is incredibly nerdy, but I love it. And it tells us about the later life of these archaeological objects as artifacts. So we can answer questions around storage and display, motivations behind early curation, etc. Now, all of the above combined paints a really rich picture of this discipline, but it also allows us to reconstruct lost information, from information about life in the field to lost provenance for these objects, elements of object biography, who collected it, was it displayed, etc. Now, if we zoom in on the first layer of our stories, we get a real social history of archaeology. Now, what kind of things can we find out? Well, you can find out how archaeologists were influenced by their environment, what they read, how they lived. Archaeology doesn't exist in a vacuum, and this is a really useful reminder. Newspaper samples that we're finding with this material tells us about the Jubilee of Queen Victoria. It tells us about Spanish brigands. It tells us about what's happening around the world in different social circles. So it's a good reminder, it's a useful reminder that archaeological knowledge is a product of its time at any given point. And vice versa. How did archaeologists themselves impact their environments? The economic impact, all the stuff that they're buying and bringing to the field, where are they buying it? More on this later. It gives us a social history of early academia, a snapshot of Egyptology scholarship in action. For instance, I have found wrapped around objects Margaret Murray's tuition notes, Petrie's original Tarkan manuscript draft, examination strips for early students, lecture invites, things that actually wouldn't have been preserved at all if they had not been recycled. This tells us about archaeology, but also other early disciplines like medicine and biology that crossed over at the time. There's potential there, for instance, for doing network analysis, looking at how they've influenced each other over time. And finally, ephemera allows us to retrace stories of people and reinsert voices less often heard into the narrative. So the quote-unquote hidden histories, although I don't like that term, of early Egyptology. Egyptian archaeologists, women, administrators, students, secretaries. A great one, which is not pictured here, is I found a mid-century cigarette butt in a drawer in the manager's office. And I just love to think of who the student was, or a member of staff who went, oh no, someone's coming in, and left that in the drawer for 50 years. So let's take a closer look at this one, shall we? Now, where do archaeologists shop? Decisions around supplies can tell you something about the priorities of expedition teams. For instance, back in the 1700s, 1798, I think, the team of engineers, cartographers, artists, and scholars that Napoleon brought to Egypt recorded so much information that they ran out of pencils and chose to melt bullets to obtain fresh lead. Now, in our collection, what does that look like? What do the decisions around supplies tell us about the priorities of the people who constituted the Petrie Museum collection? I would say at this stage in the research, probably that the incentive is collect. Petrie himself was criticized in his lifetime for the sheer amount of archaeological material that he was exporting out of Egypt. And we see that reflected in the ephemera. There's evidence that, archaeological teams were importing boxes on purpose, and yet they were still making do with whatever containers were available because they were running out of the things they'd brought on purpose. So in terms of economy, archaeologists are consumers, suppliers, and employers. So they would have had a real impact on the local economy of their own neighborhood, at home, and in their fieldwork area. So where an archival notebook only lists the required equipment, prices paid, ephemera actually allows us to paint a more detailed picture of these networks. In typical Victorian fashion, which is very convenient, a lot of these boxes are branded with a lot of text, which includes the addresses of the shops where this material is coming from. For example, bespoke makers like W. Potters and Sons, manufacturers of leather cases, nested boxes, jeweller's wool, window tickets, etc. These are very helpful. So Amara Thornton, a few years ago, tried to reconstruct where archaeologists in the late 19th and early 20th century bought their supplies. But she encountered a roadblock, which is that while the lists survive, sourcing the stores were very difficult. I have started mapping them because now we have the addresses. So I'm going to temporarily attempt to share another part of my screen. Let's see if this works. Okay, you should now be seeing an interactive map. It'll be a quick snapshot. It's still a work in progress. But what this map shows us is where archaeologists were shopping, and as a direct result, where archaeological teams were having an economic impact. Now you can see that anything that's orange or red are more personal, individual objects that reflect personal preference, but also consumables. So this is tobacco, matches, candles, things like that. So you can see that they were being purchased locally where excavations were happening. They were being purchased, people were clearly also bringing them along from, students were coming in and visitors were coming into sites from all over Europe, and they were bringing this material with them. In terms of what archaeologists were bringing from the UK, you've got the technical material. So everything that's green is photographic equipment, lantern slides, glass plates, etc. It seems that industrially speaking, the center for that was northwest London, which there might have been more centers for this kind of supplies, but that's where Petrie lived. That's where Petrie and Hilda Petrie lived. So that's clearly where they were shopping. And then for other consumables like food, what's blue? Food, shipping, boxes. Archaeologists were shopping primarily on the Strand, in Soho, and around ECL, which is wholly unsurprising. So I'm going to quickly switch back to my PowerPoint. Bear with me 1 second. Okay. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us a few things. It tells us that what was considered the technical supplies were brought in from abroad, and the consumables were purchased locally. Medicine, you might notice there are a few medicine containers on my slides. Medicine was purchased in the UK and brought to the field in Egypt, where it was handed out locally. There's evidence in the archive of Petrie providing medical supplies and treatment to local Egyptian people that might not otherwise have been accessible locally, so carbolic tooth powder, painkillers, etc. Interestingly, and I say interesting, by interestingly, I mean, so Petrie wrote a guide to roughing it in Egypt. He really thought of himself as a countercultural traveler who wasn't interested in quote unquote high-class travel. And yet his teams were constantly importing food. They were not, they might have bought bread, meats locally, but the bulk of the food supplies were imported systematically from Britain. So we've got preserves, competing brands of cocoa at the breakfast table, and if the old saying of "you are what you eat" is true, then digging through early archaeologist leftovers confirms this insider perspective of field archaeology as counterculture, but not too much. I included this picture because you will notice on the shelf, this is from Margaret Murray's photo album, you will notice on the shelf this very cocoa tin that is still in our collection containing some pigments. Now, a bit later down the line, you begin to see the beginnings of duty-free shopping, and then the map of how archaeologists are impacting the environment changes radically. from that point onwards. Now, if we move on to the second layer of storytelling, once this stuff was reused and became archaeological tools, what can it tell us about early archaeological practice? Recycling tells us a lot about how archaeologists worked, but also how they conceived of what they were doing. So first of all, the extension of this idea of archaeology is counterculture. There is a fantastic bit of unpublished material. There's an unpublished essay from Petrie called A Compendium of Civilization, where it first looks like it's an ethnographer talking about an unknown civilization. And then as the story progresses, you realize that it's Petrie that's having his breakfast tea in the field and looking through a catalogue of supply goods and goes, corsets, champagne, what could we possibly need that for? I'm sitting on a crate and that's perfectly sufficient. The point is, I think there was an intentional effort to appear to reuse and recycle stuff as much as possible. This idea of, recycled goods are enough for us as archaeologists. Dan Potter has suggested from the National Museum of Scotland has suggested that there's potentially a performative aspect of, saving money of fieldwork, which is not just performed for the archaeologists, but also for donors. This idea of making your money go very far, which is a really, really interesting suggestion. But regardless, there is a clear difference in packaging between what was used by the archaeologists for the material that they wanted to research versus the material that was being used in private collections or for display or being sent out to subscribers. The recycling element also allows us to date the finds and sort of retrieve provenance where we've lost it. For example, these cigarette packets, that the specific makes of cigarettes only lasted a year or two. So when we don't know where or when the material was excavated, we can go, well, these cigarettes were only being issued between 1922 and 1923. So here's a list of possible field seasons. Same with the photographic glass plates. We have dates from when they changed branding, when they registered as limited companies, etc., which allows us to retrace the find date and therefore the provenance. Now, do different packaging choices reflect different value attributed to these objects? That is a very good question that someone asked me, and I started looking into it. We can start looking at, what was given relative priority or importance, what was collected on the fly versus what was packed carefully at the end of the field season. And what does that tell us about research interests at the time, how people valued objects? For example, in the corner, in the top, if we're going clockwise from the Cadbury's box, we've got material that was collected specifically for research purposes, what I call the no-faff packaging. We'll just use whatever's available. Then the plants material underneath, this is material that's used for teaching or reference, with annotations by people like Percy Newbery. The idea of this is that it's very clear, it's packaged and displayed in a very clear way so that people can keep going back to it, keep handling it, students specifically. Material for public display, like Petrie's coin collection. You can sort of see the process of display in action. Then we've got material for donors. So in the bottom left corner, these are genuine scale armor samples from one set of armor that was excavated by the British School of Archaeology in Egypt, in other words, Petrie. And so we see this phenomenon with armor, with coins, with some faience finds as well. The Petries seem to have put together these little sample cards that are printed that have objects, genuine, artifacts glued onto these cards. And it looks like they were likely handed out as prized collectibles, this idea of own a little bit of the past for visitors, possibly for donors. I don't know a huge amount about them yet, so if anybody does, please do get in touch. And then material that's in personal collections, but material that goes to private collectors, is displayed and packaged completely differently. Plant remains in glass display, displayed like jewelry, actual jewelry boxes for people to keep strings of beads, etc. It's clear that we're on the other end of the scale in this instance, and people are keeping material that they value not for their research potential, but for their personal, often emotive connection. There might also be a gendered aspect to the packaging and the ephemera around private collections. Potentially more on this later if we have time. And lastly, can we identify personal interests or individual research processes from the ephemera? For instance, this is a fragment of the ladies' newspaper. It's the only fragment of women's magazine that I have found in the ephemera so far. Is from the early 1900s, based not on the date. There's no date anymore, but there is a hat, and based on the latest fashion, this would have been the early 1900s. I don't know. We've lost provenance for this, so I'm not sure who was reading it. What I do know is that it was wrapped around jewelry. Of course, one example is not enough, but if more material like this turns up, is it enough to say that we can see that women were perhaps, women in the field were perhaps interested in the histories of other women in antiquity? Maybe. Maybe more convincingly, we have this excellent case study. So one of these tins is not like the others. The one on the bottom is of significantly better quality. If I was going into the field, that is what I would take. And it is signed Spurrell on the bottom. If anybody hasn't heard of blacksmith Charles John Spurrell, he was an archaeologist and geologist whose work in Egyptology is probably less known than his work in British archaeology, mostly in Kent. Now, at first I thought, okay, he might have signed his name on the tin when he was in the field because much better, it's a much better quality tin. We've all been there. It's my tin, I want it back, I'm putting my name on it. But Spurrell actually never made it out to Egypt. He was great friends with Flinders Petrie, and he worked with him to prepare material coming back from excavation, but he never went to the field. So this could indicate potentially material that he had earmarked for his personal research when he was preparing it. We know he was preparing this material. He was interested in paints and pigments and binders. Now, these sample boxes originally contained resin samples. So there is something there to look into. The next step for me on this one will be to cross-reference the ephemera with the correspondence in the collection. We've got plenty of letters going back and forth between Petrie and Spurrell. So it would be great to know if we can find out more about these these are orphan resin samples. We don't really know where they came from, when they were excavated, who by. So hopefully we can find out more. The label that you can see next to it says from Rahotep Mummy, with mummy misspelt. That is Spurrell's handwriting. He has misspelt mummy in every single label. I don't know which mummy this Rahotep mummy is. Again, if anyone knows, please get in touch. But I do know that these stamps, specifically, these sort of stamp-shaped labels, were used exclusively, not in the field, exclusively in London, in the Petrie collection. And they're often a marker of boxes that were reused for something else. Which brings us to the third layer of stories that the ephemera can tell us. What happens to these objects after they're brought from the field? Contrary to popular belief, museums are not where objects go to die. So, the story continues. What can this tell us? We can find out histories of storage and display, from very official to very makeshift. What did people like to see? What was hidden away in drawers? The redistribution of finds. Ephemera allows us to track the trickier ones, like the O.H. Myers collection, the Robert Mond bequest. For a while in the 1920s to 1950s, as many of you might know, there was a lot of going back and forth of small collections as bequests between UCL, the EEF, sometimes the Wellcome Collection, the Institute of Archaeology, which was independent at the time. So these trickier trajectories are much easier to track with ephemera. We also get an insight into private collections, which, as I've said before, could be very differently motivated and which, in the words of Stephen Quirk, show a lot of personality. So that's another area ripe for future research. We also find out about museum operations, from passive-aggressive museum notes from former curators to major events like fires and floods. Not only do we find out about which curators were grumpy, but we also find out about the museum ecosystem, stories around future-proofing, and this allows us to date museum events that might not have been recorded in the archive. More on this later. Now, the archaeology of academia is a whole other thing. We can start mapping networks of collaboration, who knew whom, what were the links between different institutions, disciplines, departments. Here, epigraphy and identifying handwriting is extremely useful. And finally, company culture in early academia, and in its closely associated fields like the Foreign Service. There's a real link between archaeology and diplomacy, and we really see that those stories shine through this material. And yes, if anybody is wondering, that is genuinely a Christmas card from the YMCA Baghdad. There's no date on it. I'm still looking into it. Again, if anyone has any information, let me know. But yeah, we've also got, Christmas cards from the 30s from the American Foreign Service saying things like, oh, is 9:30 the best time for eggnog? What do you think? Now, let's take a minute. I want to go back on the fires and floods real quick. I would like to tell you a little story, which is what happens when things go wrong. Now, in my very first week in my job at the Petrie Museum, I almost had a heart attack when I opened a drawer to find this. This is a tray that is completely covered in soot, filled with what really looks like rubble. But unfortunately, it looks like rubble, but it's in the pre-dynastic cupboard in the Petrie Museum. And so I started investigating. Now, looking at this material in the top right-hand corner, we have a label. What does that label say? It says, from Miss Lafleur's laboratory. Who's Miss Lafleur? Well, Violette Lafleur was a Quebecois conservator. She started as a student in the Egyptology department at UCL and slowly worked her way up to volunteer museum assistant, conservator, conservation teacher, etc. She worked on a huge proportion of the objects in the Petrie Museum. And this is actually in the picture here, this is the second iteration of her laboratory. Now, you may or may not know, but something happens at UCL in 1941. If you zoom in on that note, it says, some of these lumps perished in the 1939-45 war. So in 1941, there was a direct hit on the main building at UCL. And unfortunately, unfortunately for many reasons, but one of the reasons is the original Petrie Museum was under the dome in that building. Now, what did that mean for the collection? So some of it had already been packed and put into storage, but as the museum was still operating, some of it was still out, including the conservation lab. And so evidently, this is some of the material that had been left behind. Violette Lafleur herself had actually lost her flat in the Blitz shortly before, I think a few days before, but she came as soon as she heard the news of the direct strike and worked tirelessly overnight with colleagues to pack the collections away and put them into storage safely. So she really led those efforts. So what we gather from this tray is that as soon as that had happened, she got to work repairing some of these objects. And indeed, if you look at the newspaper that is lining the tray, it is dated to the 24th of November, 1944. So what we get here really is a snapshot of early conservation practice in action. It's really exciting because she clearly just dropped what she was doing partway through the work. So we've got a bowl with some fragments. We've got a list of material that she'd identified and matched to individual tombs at Badari. They had original accession numbers. She'd even given them part numbers. The work got very, very, very far. We can see that there are some glass slides, so it looks like she was preparing to possibly thin section some of them, or I don't really know what she was doing with the glass sheets. She was putting together the references on the labels to publications that referred to this material. So the work got really, really far. And then it seems to have been abandoned. Now, what I only found out much later down the line is that the second laboratory also caught fire. This one. That one was at Foster Court, across the road from the Petrie Museum, as it is now. And it caught fire. So it looks like when this work was interrupted. So we really have like a Pompeii style snapshot of early conservation. Funnily enough, this entire tray was reaccessioned in the early 2000s by someone who clearly went, well, I don't really know what to do with this material, who clearly had not read the ephemera because the UC numbers are there, the accession numbers are there, but who went, well, this is now one thing. And I would argue that's really helpful because I would argue that this new object should represent this entire tray and everything in it. And it tells a different story, which is, just as much worth telling as the story of pre-dynastic Egypt. So, I hope I have succeeded in giving you a really, really whistle-stop tour of all the things that ephemera can do for you. Please don't throw them out if you're responsible for collections. There's a lot of potential there, lots of different avenues for research, for display, for storytelling. One thing is sure is that it gets people very excited. We've had responses from artists, from curators, from researchers, from historians. And we're beginning to work with other institutions like the Palestine Exploration Fund, possibly other museums in London and internationally, to build what I'd like to see as a community of practice for historic museums and collections that have this material and aren't really sure where to start. So if you would like to join this community of practice, please get in touch. In my slide here, you will find my email, but also a QR code. So lots and lots of different ways of getting in touch. The idea down the line would be to maybe have an event or a series of events that are all about ephemera. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. What a fascinating lecture. What's the favourite piece of archaeological ephemera that you found in the Petrie?
Oh, okay. I have one which is not on my slides. It was on my slides, and I thought I would not have time to talk about it. So you'll just have to imagine it. In our collection, we have a sprig of wheat in a little cardboard box. That is not a museum issue cardboard box. And there is a handwritten label that says mummy wheat. And there is a typed up card that explains that this is wheat that was collected from between the linen wrappings of a mummified body, and that if it is planted, then the crops will grow bountifully. Now, this is an urban legend from the late 19th, early 20th century. Essentially, this is the kind of tourist stuff that you could find in the markets in Cairo. So I thought, why do we have this? And why is it catalogued in the museum catalogue and in the database as mummy wheat? So I did a little bit of digging, and it turns out that this piece was donated by someone called Lady Middleton, who was the widow in the 1970s or 80s, I can't remember, but it was donated by Lady Middleton, who was the wife, or the widow, of L.A. Chen Middleton, who was Hilda Petrie's cousin's son. So what happened? What does that mean? What happened is that Hilda Petrie, so Linda's Petrie's wife, purchased this probably in a market in Cairo, running out of ideas for souvenirs, gave this to her little nephew, going, "Look, this is a very special sprig of wheat." He must have been very young, like 7 or 8 at the time. And she went, "This is a very special object. It comes from a mummy. This is the legend," and told it to him, and he believed it, and he treasured it his entire life. Told the story to his wife, and convinced his wife that it was so special that when he passed away, she donated it to the museum, thinking the story was real. And I think that tells you a real story about how the enduring power of, um, archaeology and Egyptology and storytelling, and how these objects mean very different things to different people.
Yeah, so true. That's fascinating. I love that. Yeah, I think this collection of materials is so fascinating, and as I think I said before the event started to you, but I'll say to everyone how fascinating I found this article, because it's such an interesting collection of materials that there's so little thought of in normal circumstances. But yeah, it's through this lecture and through your article, it's really interesting, to tease out those insights of the time about the archaeologists and about people they knew. It's just it's so interesting, and a topic that can be researched for probably a very long time.
Lifetimes, I think, lifetimes.
To summarize just some of the comments, lots of people in the chat have been very complimentary, saying how wonderful your presentation has been. Also, what a brilliant introduction to this kind of material it has been. So thank you so much, Lisa, for presenting for us today. And of course, I will do another shameless plug of the EES Egyptian Archaeology magazine, where Lisa published her article. And so do go onto the online shop and purchase that. And of course, do visit the Petrie Museum of Egyptian and Sudanese Archaeology. Lisa, would you like to just tell us when people can visit and the times you're open?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are open to the public from 1 to 5 on Tuesday to Friday, and 11 to 5 on Saturdays. You are also very, very welcome. Everyone is welcome to book research appointments to look at ephemera or, actual archaeological objects. And those take place on Mondays. There's quite a bit of a lead-in time for that, because we're a little oversubscribed. But anybody can come and book. You don't have to, as long as you have an idea of what you want to look at, you don't have to be a serious researcher. You can be anyone.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for letting everyone know. I think hopefully some people will take you up on that. It would be brilliant to see some of this stuff. Those things you mentioned, like original manuscripts and all sorts of exciting things that, would have been lost to time if not used in this way.
I very much hope so.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, everyone. A huge thank you to Lisa for presenting today on this fascinating topic. And of course, yes, highly recommend the Petrie. Do go and visit if you're local or next time you're visiting London. And thank you all for attending this Egypt Exploration Society lecture today. Of course, we do host all sorts of events, so do check out our website or help us support this programme by becoming a member today. But I think all that's remaining for me to say is a huge thank you to everyone, and hopefully we'll see you another time. Okay, thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you.